Hello and welcome back to Retro Island Diskettes, the podcast where we cast away a guest to Retro Island, but not first without allowing them to choose 8 music tracks of computer origins, through which to share their life in retro with us. And Andrew, what a guest we have today.
We certainly do, Neil. Today our guest is showing their experiences from the dark world of software piracy. He was a member of Quartex, a group any old school gamer would recognise from Cracktros appearing on their floppy disks or bulletin boards. And his past run-ins with the law still follow him to this day. Hence, while we'll be only addressing him by his original handle, welcome, Beast from Quartex.
I'm Beast, and the track we'd like to start with is from Defender of the Crown on the Atari ST.
That then was the music from the Cinemaware classic Defender of the Crown on the Atari ST. So, Beast, does this tune tell us something about your start to computers and your relationship with computers?
Well, it does for the Atari ST and for the 16-bit era, but I actually started on computers obviously a fair bit before that. And I started at school when I was about 14 or so with the TRS-80, and after that I got my own computers at home. I think I had a Dragon for about a week, a BBC Micro, because I was a posh kid. I then sold that, got myself a Spectrum. I also had a Amstrad CPC, and then after that I got into the 16 bits, and the Atari ST was the first one I got. And Defender of the Crown was one of the first games I actually got on it.
So we'll obviously be talking about software piracy and your part in that a little later today. But thinking back to those early 8-bits, can you remember the first time you perhaps pirated a game?
Well, I never really thought of it as pirating a game. It was just we're copying a game so that I can play it. I kind of never really thought about the implications. I think most kids really didn't at the time. I remember it was probably on the ZX Spectrum where so many people had tapes and we just swapped tapes, and you did a tape-to-tape in maybe a crappy Amstrad duplicating tape-to-tape type thing. But yeah, I never really thought about the idea of piracy as such.
I think, when I think back to those times, it's funny, you did touch on a point there, and that we really didn't think of it as piracy. You're right, it was just sort of sharing games.
I think we all recorded the chart show on a Sunday, didn't we? And you'd write down on your cassette tape at what time what song came on so you could listen to the top 40. And when you're doing that day in, day out, then it doesn't seem any different to copying computer software, does it? It was just the norm.
And you did the same thing with your software tapes. You'd have 4 or 5 games on the same tape, and then you'd end up fast-forwarding ridiculous amounts of time and waste time looking at the tape counter to get to the right spot for where you'd put that copied game.
So why don't you tell us how you got into copying games on the Atari ST in particular then?
Well, again, it was a little bit more by accident than design. I wanted to get hold of games. I didn't have games. So I found people advertising in magazines like I think it was Micromart. So I think the way people used to do it in those days was you would send them some blank discs, and maybe for every 2 blank discs you sent them, they'd send you back 1 full of stuff. And that was a way to get started. And then you'd have a library of stuff that you could trade with other people. And I remember I picked up a lot of games that were the early compilation discs on the Atari ST. So from groups like Automation and Was Not Was and LSD and things like that, they used to put together 4 or 5 games that they'd squeeze onto the disc. And that was really where I got into mail trading.
This was just all being advertised openly in legitimate publications that you could just pick up down at the newsagents and see an advert there for pirated games, essentially.
Yeah, I think people were a little bit slightly more subtle than that, though. They used to sort of say swap games on the Atari ST or something like that, or they might even advertise that they meant public domain stuff, but yeah, they meant pirate stuff.
Beast, you mentioned a moment ago about stuffing, 5 games on a floppy on the Atari ST. Was there any technologies involved in doing that?
Well, software, yes. I wouldn't say it wasn't hardware involved, but what the crackers would do is they would crack the game in such a way that they could transfer it maybe to a single file, and then they would pack it using their own packing routines. So these people were basically developing glorified versions of zip, arg, rar, all those sort of compression techniques that we use today were being developed by crackers. It would take maybe a bit longer to load. Sometimes it actually worked out to be faster, because by loading less data in and then depacking it, it would actually be quicker than loading the full data in from the disk in an uncompressed format.
So you had the Atari ST. Did you have that for a little longer than all of those 8-bits, or was your attention span still short with the Atari?
I have to confess it was fairly short. I was living in Cambridgeshire at the time, and I went into the Cambridge computer store because running in their window was a Commodore Amiga running a demo of, I think it was Blood Money. I don't know if you remember the intro for Blood Money, but it had an asteroid playfield type demo, so you looked like you were flying a spacecraft through a field of asteroids. As soon as I saw that, I thought, I have to have this machine, and I bought an Amiga pretty much that day. I got the Amiga, I got it home, I started doing the same sort of thing, getting hold of games, and I managed to get hold of one of my favourite games at the time, which was, I'd played it to death on the Atari ST, I got it on the Amiga, and then, as was my wont, I was already bored of it and didn't really play it very much more. But that happens to be one of the next tracks that I've chosen, and that was Millennium 2.2 on the Amiga. Here we go.
David Whittaker, the composer of the Millennium track there, made some great contributions to video game music. Why does this title stand out for you when talking about switching from Atari to Amiga?
Well, as I was saying, this was a title that I played on the Atari ST to death. I remember leaving my girlfriend at the time. She'd gone to bed and I just kept playing Millennium 2.2 from start to finish, and I have no idea what time I got to bed that evening, but it was one of the few games in my life that I've actually finished. So I enjoyed that a heck of a lot on the Atari ST. And then when I got my Amiga, it was probably one of the first games that I wanted to get on the Amiga.
So at this time, Beast, you were still were you still trading discs through those magazines? You weren't part of any kind of scene or any kind of group at this point. You were just trading for your own means. Is that right?
Yep, I was still mail trading, as we would call it in proper speak, and I did the same sort of situation I did with the Atari ST. So I sent off discs to people, swapped discs, got more titles, and made contacts. And some of them were quite friendly. And one of them told me that he'd got himself a modem. So I asked him, "What is this modem of which you speak?" And he explained it, and he'd bought a highly expensive 2400 baud modem.
Wow, 2400.
Exactly. And he was connecting to some bulletin boards, and he told me he was on this pirate bulletin board. And the bulletin board in question was a board called Treasure Island, which I later got to know the sysop quite well. And as we'll come to later, he also got busted. But my friend who'd got me into this told me about this, also told me how he'd got access to the board. When I realised that you didn't have to go through this whole rigmarole of sending people titles, waiting for them to send stuff back, it was instant gratification. I thought this sounded quite clever. So in the way that I am, it was go large or go home. So I said to him, "What is the best modem you can buy?" And he told me, at the time it was a Miracom US Robotics 14.4 Courier HST modem. And they would cost about £600 at the time. But he said to me, If you're a sysop of a bulletin board, you can get it with a sysop discount, and it's just over £450. I wasn't really planning to run a bulletin board. It was just I would set one up so that I could convince the US Robotics guys that I was a genuine bulletin board, and therefore I qualified for the discount. But by this time, I had got myself my Amiga 500. If I explain slightly on that, my Amiga 500 lasted about 2 days before I got bored of it and realised, I realised that there was better things out there. And I'd seen from reading magazines that there was an Amiga 2000. So again, go large or go home. I put the Amiga 500 up for sale. It was 2 days old. I ordered myself an Amiga 2000. I ordered myself a hard disk card, a Quantum 40 megabyte hard disk.
Wow.
£750 for that. $799 for the Amiga. That was the equipment that I was going to later run the bulletin board on.
So the distribution then of pirated software was more that there would be somebody who had, say, an Amiga 2000 or something a bit more expensive who would download the game, and then they would revert to copying the discs and distributing them at the playground or wherever else. Is that how it worked?
Not really. It was more a case of the people who were doing bulletin board trading and with modems tended to have the better kit. So they would tend to have either an Amiga 500 with lots of memory, or an Amiga 500 with a hard disk, or maybe a 2000 with a hard disk. And they would be trading stuff from their hard disks. They might never put them into floppy disk format at all. The people who got them for mail trading were getting them from these people, and they might put it then onto a disk, and then that might be given to a friend who might mail trade it. So you were getting stuff much earlier. And the whole idea of being on a proper, I hate to use the word, elite bulletin board, was that you were getting the stuff straight away, the same day as it was cracked. And that was something you wouldn't get if you were mail trading. You could be weeks after release before you got a game.
Sure. But eventually they would all filter down to copy parties and these other distribution methods, which is how people like me who wasn't on BBSs on the Amiga, that was more in my PC days, would end up having the cracktros on the games that I got.
Yeah, that would make you a lamer by today's standards.
A lamer.
It's interesting, lamer was the word I've used for the last 25 years to describe one of my best friends, because I always used to wind him up. So even on my phone contact list, it would say lamer when I want to ring him.
So why don't you tell us how you got your handle?
I have to confess, this is rather embarrassing. I was struggling to think of a name for my handle because everybody had to have a handle on a BBS. You never put your real name in. And at the time, I was quite enjoying the game Shadow of the Beast. It wasn't necessarily the greatest game, but it had beautiful music, and I chose the name Beast. It seemed appropriate, and it kind of also stuck with me because the number of the beast is 666. I was born in 1966. Let's leave the rest out.
And there was I thinking it was your nickname that your girlfriend had given you.
Afraid not. But that brings us anyhow very nicely to the next piece of music, which is the music from Shadow of the Beast.
So that was another David Whittaker track, this time from Shadow of the Beast, which was a real showpiece for the Amiga, with its 50 frame per second graphics and great music, even if the gameplay was rock hard. You mentioned there your first modem and your entry into BBSs and then upgrading to the Amiga 2000. Did that setup then grow into something bigger as you became a host of a BBS board or a sysop?
Well, it continually evolved. It was started off with the one modem. It started off with a 40 megabyte hard disk. Over time, I got myself co-sysops, so people who helped with running the bulletin board. One of them had the handle of Sprog. He happened to work for a large laptop manufacturer, I think, PC manufacturer, and occasionally hardware used to, I think, come from their repair facilities and ended up in my house. So my hard disk got upgraded from 40 megabytes to 650 megabytes to, I think at the time that I was raided, I was well over 2 terabytes. No, gigabytes, sorry. I'm confused.
Terabytes
would have been impressive. 2 gigabytes, which was massive in those days. I went from one telephone line to, at the time I was raided, 5 telephone lines, 5 US Robotics modems. You can imagine that's £2,000 worth of modems on their own.
So when you were doing this, this was a hobby for you?
This was a hobby, but there was money involved, and the bulletin board did make some money.
Okay, so it sort of paid for its own upkeep.
Yeah, it paid for the investment into it. I don't think it was not something that I was making a living from, but if I made money off the bulletin board, it would get invested into making the bulletin board bigger and better.
Okay, it's because it sounds like a full-time job.
It did get in the way of my relationship. Probably one of the reasons that relationship ended. It's not something I regret. I'm quite happy, but it did interfere with my life quite a lot. And also, when I got involved in the cracking scene through the bulletin board, then there would be interruptions in the middle of the night from things like conference calls with other group members, and you'd get involved with talking to the crackers about what titles were going to be cracked. And then there's other stuff that as I got further and further into the actual group situation.
So at this point, you were still dealing with your BBS activities. You weren't actually in a group. And you mentioned status there. You must have been gaining a reputation and a certain status for the BBS board that you were hosting and the amount that you were able to offer people with those 5 lines in and the amount of software you must have had stored on your hard disk. Was the status important to you?
I think if I'm honest, yes, it was. I tried to think that at the time I tried to kid myself it wasn't, but it was. At the time, I also didn't have the 5 lines. When I first got involved in a group, it was 1 telephone line. And I think the first group I got involved with I thought I was involved with, was a group called Quartex. You've probably heard of them from their Mental Hangover mega demo. We were supposedly in Quartex UK, which was the UK branch. But I suspect that large parts of Quartex didn't know we existed. And that didn't last an awfully long time before I was approached through one of my co-sysops to join Quartex. And to be honest, I'm not even sure to this day quite... Oh, no, actually, I tell a lie. It wasn't Quartex then, it was Dual Crew. And I'm still not quite sure why I got invited to join Dual Crew, but I did. And that got me into sort of a group. And then you had group members calling the bulletin board and uploading stuff, so there was a benefit to having a group around you. It was like a support network, for want of a better word. And then after that, as you got better, more status as it were, then I was invited to join Quartex, and that was when I really joined the big boys.
When members of the group were dialing into you, or when anyone was dialing into you in fact, did any of them use any precautions to hide their identity? Because we're using standard telephone lines here, was there a way of hiding your identity?
I think in those days, it may well have been before BT had the ability to look at caller ID, but people basically just dialed in. Nobody ever used their real name. Well, if they did, they wouldn't have got on the bulletin board. It was very clear to anyone dialing in that this was a private bulletin board and there was a registration system to go through, and you would have to answer a series of questions. You would have to provide telephone numbers that I could verify you on, so you were giving away some information. Some people would provide it, some didn't. you'd have to answer questions that would indicate whether or not you knew what the pirate scene was about. So you might be asked a question like, the initials QTX, what does that mean? You could be asked all sorts of cracking related questions. If you could give the answers and you could give references as well, almost everybody had to be referred by somebody else. So if you were an outsider, getting in it was quite hard.
Well, we're going to find out a bit more about your time in those groups. Before we do, we'll listen to one more track. But can you just tell us, what was the name of your BBS?
Oh yes, my BBS. Originally when it started in 1990, it was known as Nirvana, from the cult song, Every Day Nirvana. But it didn't last. I changed the name fairly soon afterwards to Arcadia, and that was the name I had for 3 or more years. And the next tune we're going to play, the reason I've chosen it is because it was a piece of music that was on the very first game I ever illegally downloaded. And the game was Paradroid 90, and it was cracked by a group called Classic, and the music was provided by a member called Desecrator, and this is Introgasm from Desecrator.
So Beast, it's obviously sounds like a very, structured arrangement here, but is there a hierarchy within the groups?
Well, not so much a hierarchy as in ranks, but there was an awful lot of organisation put into them. Everybody had a role to play in the group, and these roles were very similar across most of the groups. So we'd obviously have a leader stroke organiser, and their role was to chase people up and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing so that the group can deliver on its cracking.
So he's a project manager?
Project manager, yeah. Also a financial director, because they would hold the purse strings. There would be crackers, the people who are actually removing the protection. There may well also be coders who are just doing things like coding crack throws. If your cracker didn't want to code a crack throw, you might have a coder who'd do it for you. There will be suppliers who are supplying the titles to be cracked. There would be couriers who are spreading the wares from one bulletin board to another. And also, particularly when your group had a release, the couriers would be tasked with making sure that they grabbed it from your distribution bulletin board and put it on all the competition's bulletin boards. So the idea was this whole competition thing. You would crack a title, and the first thing you would do, apart from putting it on your world headquarters first, would be to put it on the world headquarters of your competition as soon as possible. Because if it had gone on their world headquarters and they were also trying to crack the title, they couldn't really release it, because then they would just be seen to have been second, and nobody wants to be second.
So would they just stop their activities at that point then?
Most groups would. Some groups didn't, and there are a couple of occasions where I could think of where Quartex cracked a game, and another group, we had put it on their world headquarters. They still ignored that, released theirs, deleted ours off their bulletin board to make it look as though they were first. And this actually reminds me of a particular title, because this happened on a title called Heimdall.
Oh, I remember it, yes.
Core design, lovely game, with an axe throwing competition as well. Stolen from the film Vikings.
The graphics actually for the axe competition, I remember them on the box.
It's beautiful. And if anyone's interested, you should look at the crack on both those titles, because it was cracked by Quartex, it was cracked by Crystal. Most people will know the Crystal crack, because Crystal's cracking distribution team, their couriers were better than ours, if truth be told. They got it out more widely than ours. Quartex was first, I know this for a fact. And it was deleted from their bulletin board because they didn't want people to know that we'd beaten them. But when you look at the cracks, when you get to the copy protection, on the Crystal game it says, enter the the code from page whatever of the manual, and you press return, and then you go to the game. On the Quartex crack, our cracker was better. He removed the routine completely, so you never even saw the question to enter the copy protection routine.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an example of a really quality crack. Some people don't even know it was cracked by us because they didn't see the cracking message, because there was nothing there. But if you actually look at the two, judge for yourself. I think ours was the better job.
Yeah, so cracked first, cracked better, but outdone by a better marketing team or courier team.
First to
Exactly.
market.
And when we were also talking about the structure, we had, as well as the couriers, we had sysops, that's the system operators from the bulletin boards.
So that's what you would have been.
That's what I was.
Okay.
We also had pay members,
Pay members.
people who basically wanted to say they were in a group, and this happened with a lot of groups, people who wanted to say they were a member of Quartex or Paradox or something and basically paid for the privilege.
Wow, the Patreons.
I'm sure you value your patrons more than we valued our pay members. But the pay members would also be contributing money into the group, and the money was needed for funding the group's, I was going to say legitimate activities, funding the group purchasing the games, because obviously to crack a game we probably have to purchase it. Sometimes they would come from inside game companies, from people who in game companies who just gave up their title because they were a bit dodgy themselves, and quite often we would have to buy them in stores or from distributors. Later in my career in this, I was supplying titles, and it meant I had an account at a distributor so that I could get the games the day before they went into the shops in the UK.
So with regard to your pay members, can you remember how much they had to pay? Was it still a relatively good deal to them in terms of what they would get back?
They would get, for that £25 a month, they would get an hour a day. So or maybe 2 hours a day. It depends on how busy the bulletin board were. But if you think that was 30 hours, they would be able to download 60 or 70 titles a month. So it's quite a good deal for them in that way. And that £25 a month would go towards the running costs of the bulletin board and the investment in the new kit. And at its peak, a lot of people didn't like the fact that I had a fair few paying members, but I maybe would take £200 or more a month.
As your investment increased into all of this equipment, did you ever have any concerns that it might that you might get a knock on the door, or did you have contingency plans in case that knock ever came?
I tried not to think about it like most people. In May 1993, a friend of mine, the guy who ran the Treasure Island bulletin board where I first downloaded Paradroid 90, Jonathan his name was, he was busted by Fast, and there was an inevitable panic across the UK bulletin board scene. People started thinking it could be me, and a number of bulletin boards went dark some went dark for good, some went dark for a day, and some didn't. I seem to recall we closed down for about 10 hours or something like that before we suddenly thought, well, if they're going to come, they're going to come.
Yeah, and I can see you've got a little smile on your face here, because it's maybe from my perspective, and maybe Neil, that we're imagining this, like a mafia or terrorist cells. It's all this very organised things, but clearly, it wasn't quite that level.
It certainly wasn't a mafia. It was very organised. There were a number of things people were doing, as well as pirating software, that were illegal. People needed to call internationally because you were distributing your titles across the world. This wasn't a UK only thing. This was worldwide. The best place for people to distribute to was the United States, and the reason they were doing that was because of AT&T calling cards. AT&T calling cards allowed American AT&T customers to call back home not for free, but using their AT&T calling card. So if you had an AT&T calling card that you'd obtained slightly illegally, you could dial back to America. And that's one of the things that a lot of people did. And some people got involved in that. There was also black boxing and blue boxing. I don't know if you've come across them.
I do recall these terms.
Going into the world of freaking now.
Phone freaking. Now, Black boxing I came across very briefly, but I didn't get involved in. Black boxing, my understanding, and different people use different terms for some of these things. Black boxing was where your phone socket at home was modified slightly so that a resistor was put in, so that when you picked the phone up, the usual voltage drop that would happen when you picked the phone up didn't get back to the network, so they didn't actually send the charging signal. So if you had deployed a black box system to your bulletin board, anyone who called you was calling for free. So if they knew you were black boxing, they would be calling you like mad. And I know people who did that, and I know people who got busted for that, and they were charged, I think, with theft of electricity. That was the only offence they could actually be charged of. But blue boxing was much more clever and much more serious. Blue boxing was you basically seizing control of an international trunk line by sending a control signal over the phone line. So you would basically dial the number you wanted to access, and then as soon as they picked the phone up, you would send your signal, it would seize the telephone line, it would go bleep bleep, and then you'd hear a clunk back. You would have seized the telephone line from them. Then you could dial anywhere in the world using that telephone line, and all you were charged for was your 0800 telephone call, which was free. At the time I was actually raided, there was evidence of blue boxing going on the screens, and there were screenshots taken with a blue box dialer on the main screen.
Well, why don't you tell us what your next choice of track is, and then we can go into finding out a little bit more about the raids and the competition among the groups, and some more stories, please.
Okie dokie. My next choice is Speedball 2 on the Amiga, cracked by Crystal, of course.
You mentioned the competition between the groups. Did you have one primary competitor to Quartex, or were there several that you were competing against?
A good example was, this was at the time that I'd started supplying titles, and when I say supplying titles, it basically meant initially I would trog down to the Virgin Megastore in central London, armed with some group money, and would buy 2 or 3 of the new titles that had come out that day. Only ever the titles that came out that day, because anything else was too slow. And then I would rush home, and then I would send it to our cracker to crack. Later on, I had a distribution account, which meant I could get it a day before the shops, but this particular story is related to when I got 3 titles from the Virgin Megastore. I got home with those 3 titles, and I started warping up the first one. Now, I say warping up, it's basically you read an image of the disc using a special program that would enable you to read all the dodgy sectors as well, so that the cracker could then patch and then deprotect the game. And we had 3 titles. I remember one of them was RBI Baseball 2, another was PP Hammer, and I forget the third title. But I remember sending RBI Baseball 2 was the first one I sent to our cracker, and our cracker was called The Surge. I uploaded it with my modem direct to him, and I started warping up the second title. By the time I had warped the second title, he had cracked the first title and packed it and was ready for me to download it. He was that quick. The third title was the game PP Hammer. We got beaten on the third title. I know that because I remember PP Hammer was cracked by a guy called Nomad from a group called Crystal, and they beat us in distributing it. So we didn't actually bother with the crack of that, because by the time we were ready to crack it, it was already on the Bulletin Board World Headquarters. So yeah, it was friendly competition. We got 2 titles out of 3 that day. It wasn't a bad result.
But was it the case that a lot of copy protection games, were they using the same copy protection?
Haha, you're asking this question because you know the answer.
I don't, honestly.
Really?
I'm assuming they did.
Okay. Anyone in the know? Rob Northern Copylock. That was the program that was used by the lazy companies that were making a barely acceptable effort to protect their titles. It would take a cracker minutes, if that, to crack a copylock protected game. They might as well not have bothered.
So let's talk about when things started to turn a little bit sour for you, Beast. Let's talk about Fast first of all, because we all knew about Fast. We would read our copies of Amiga format and they would take out full page ads telling us not to copy floppy disks and the terrible things that could happen to us if we did. I'm not sure any of us were completely convinced that they really had teeth. Did you actually have any fear of Fast, or any other groups for that matter, who were out to shut down pirates?
Well, Fast were really the only game in town. In those days, it was quite early from a legal perspective. There was the Copyrights, Designs and Patents Act, and there was the Computer Misuse Act, but all these things were quite early, and most of the police forces were not really into computer crime. The Met had set up a computer crime unit, Metropolitan Police Force in the UK, but that was probably about it. But no, I don't think we really worried about Fast particularly. Fast they were set up by software publishers, and they were funded by the European Leisure Software Publishers Association, ELSPA, and they employed a number of investigators who generally were retired police officers, not senior retired police officers. They tended to be fairly, I'm going to sound really arrogant here, but basic investigators. And yes, they did get me, but I don't think it was through any great talent of theirs that they got me.
Well, why don't you tell us what your next tune is, Beast, and then you can tell us all about how they did get you.
The next tune I've chosen is the music from Xenon 2 Megablast, the music that was famously composed by Bomb the Bass, and on the Atari ST version, it's pretty awful. On the Amiga, it's quite good. It's not my kind of music, but I just think it was quite indicative of, certainly, of the quality of music you could get on an Amiga at the time.
So Xenon 2, very exciting track, and it sounds like your life was taking exciting directions now. But before we go into your inevitable bust, can you tell us a little bit about what was going on with maybe some of the other group members, in this exciting period?
Yeah, well, a number of people were getting busted either at that time I got busted or soon after. There were inevitably, things couldn't continue the way they were forever. We had Treasure Island. My friend Jonathan got busted in May that year. One of the Quartex members got busted for taking a whiz. He was one of our couriers in the United States, and he got arrested for taking a leak in an alley, which was a fairly minor thing to get caught for. But apparently, in America, if you take a whiz against a wall, you're going to get a fine for it. In the UK, they'll probably just tell you off for it. But some of the people got busted for calling card fraud, and some of this goes on well past me. But I was at the time I got busted, I was in a group called Paradox, and Paradox, I think, they were different to Quartex. Quartex was much more friendly, and although I think Quartex was a brilliant group, Paradox were much more business-like, and Paradox were into making money, and they were doing more dodgy things than Quartex for sure. And the Paradox guys were big into this AT&T calling card business, and they were, I think, stealing numbers. There was a really big scam going on here, and one of the bulletin boards in the UK, their guy got busted for AT&T calling card fraud, and the leader of Paradox, a guy called Maximilian, was chased by the police and eventually arrested after a manhunt, for want of a better word, and he was sentenced to over 5 years in prison for his calling card. There was other potential for getting caught as well. My co-sysop plunderer, who's a guy I still know today, 25 years later, is still probably my best friend. He'd become a co-sysop originally by providing me with a PBX. Basically what we could do was we would dial an 0800 number to access this PBX and then enter a code, and then we could dial anywhere in the world and it would be billed to somebody else. And this worked for about 3 months. So this was another potential thing that we could have got in trouble for. That particular one we didn't get caught for. But yes, ultimately the law did catch up with me.
When the law did catch up with you, in what form did it take? Was it a knock at the door? Was it telephone call? Was it a raid? How did it all unfold?
It was a full-on raid. It was a knock on the door and a team of police officers outside my house. There was probably about 6 or 7 of them. I was home alone at the time, and they knocked on the door, and the guy said, "This Mr. X, this is Hertfordshire Fraud Squad. We've got a warrant to search your premises." And they came in. They searched the house, they searched the garage, they searched the attic, they searched everywhere. Even though I said, the bulletin board's here you go. They wanted to search through everything. That was quite annoying because it very much felt like an invasion of my privacy, and I wasn't hiding anything for them. I knew, it was a bust. I was being cooperative, and they basically took photos of the spare room where I was operating the bulletin board. They took photos of everything as they dismantled it. They very methodically labelled it all up, and they basically took away the entire contents of my spare room. And that was quite strange because the bulletin board had been running for 3 years at that time, 3.5 years, and certainly by that time, with all the hard disks I had running, they weren't particularly quiet hard disks, there was a steady whine coming from that bedroom. And then once they carted everything away, it was eerily quiet. It was very much like somebody had died. It was that sort of feeling of loss, I suppose. Very strange. And then, of course, then I did start to worry about, well, what happens now? And they said, well, we'll be in touch. We'll probably want to interview you. And they summoned me for an interview at the Watford police station. The next track is the music from Total Recall, and I have to confess I chose this because I loved the movie at the time. It's still my favourite movie of all time. And I recall the game on the Amiga. The game was, let's put it mildly, shite, but the music was very catchy. And I didn't even realise at the time until I think you guys told me that this was another piece by David Whittaker. So let's have that.
Total Recall, another David Whittaker composition, and a very moody track which sets the scene for a police interview room, I think. Why don't you tell us what happened in that interview room, what they asked you, and what happened next?
The solicitor had advised me to basically no comment the interview, just to see what they want to say. So the police officer was from Hertfordshire Fraud Squad, and if we were honest, he had no interest in this case at all. He didn't want to prosecute this case. He knew nothing about it. He didn't understand computers. He was forced into this because FAST had come to him, and obviously FAST were ex-police officers, and they said, we have evidence, and they got a warrant to do the raid. They got the information, but he didn't want to do any of this. He just thought, this is a bunch of nerds being nerds. I'm not interested. I want to catch some real criminals. But he went through the motions of asking me what I was doing, what was this shown on screen at the time, all these sorts of questions, and everything was no comment, no comment, no comment. And then he asked me one question, and I wasn't sure if he'd actually made it into a question, if it sounded more like a statement. So I remember saying to him, sorry, was that a question? And he said, yes. I said, no comment. And he found it very frustrating, and I actually found it hugely funny. But the inevitable happened after that was they were going to charge me. I mean, it was obvious. They had evidence. They had all my equipment, and there was plenty they could charge me with.
Okay, so it wasn't a case of them having to figure out a new and unusual thing to charge you with.
Well, they did get experts in. They didn't understand it themselves, but they knew that some criminality had been going on. The question is what I was going to get charged with. Now, at this stage, they didn't know, but they brought it up to the magistrates' court, and you'd have thought it would probably be a magistrates' court kind of thing, but the magistrates' court didn't really understand it. So when we got to magistrates' court, which took 6 months or more, they basically didn't want to deal with it. So they said, we're referring this to the Crown Court. Now, that's a bad thing from my point of view, because magistrates' court, you get off with a slap wrist, you get off with something fairly light. Crown Court is when they deploy the nasty stuff to you. And Crown Court, by this time, they were talking about the Copyrights, Designs and Patents Act and Computer Misuse Act. And they were talking about potentially up to 2 years in prison. And this is when it started to get a bit more real. This actually took 3 years to get to court. And during that time, I got together with my now wife. I became a father. My life changed. And I kind of grew up a bit. But yeah, you have this whole thing hanging over you. And I was quite grateful, really, that my girlfriend stuck with me, because that could have been it would have been very easy for her to just say, bye, this is too complicated, because it was a worry, and it was a worry for my career. Now, the court case, Crown Court, by this time, my solicitor had become a barrister. I had a barrister, a guy called Alistair Kelman, who was a specialist computer barrister, in fact, probably still the best specialist computer barrister in the country. He had previously dealt with the Prince Philip Prestel hacking scandal. That was a famous court case in I suppose it was late 80s, early 90s. And he was well known as a computer specialist. And then because it had gone to Crown Court, I was entitled to get a QC as well. But we got to Crown Court, and I had my legal team with me. We had a judge and a jury, and it was all very formal. And they charged me with conspiracy to distribute copyright items. And it was the conspiracy that was the worst bit, because they're saying you're involved in a lot of it. And that was a bit concerning, but we were still reasonably confident. And on the opposition team, there was obviously the Crown Prosecution Service. They had their expert witness. Their expert witness was a guy called Jolyon Ralph. Jolyon used to write for some of the Amiga magazines, and Jolyon also was a famous, well, not famous, but he was a small bit player in a group called Share and Enjoy, where he was known as Comrade J. And he wasn't exactly clean himself. He was their person who was supposed to go through the computer and identify what was going on. There was also David Braben of Elite fame. He was there because Frontier Elite 2 had been cracked and was being distributed on the bulletin board at the time that I was raided. And David Braben was very protective of his intellectual property, so he thought he would go there to see that justice was done. And they made lots of mistakes in what they were doing, because the first thing they did was boot up the computer, which then, by booting up the computer, changed some of the data on it, which meant their evidence chain was already contaminated. And we were going to use things like that because we could see from the CD copies they took off the computer that they had already booted it up before they took the evidence, before they froze it onto a CD. So we were reasonably confident we had defences that none of this evidence could be relied on. We also thought we had a good defence in that the evidence had been obtained illegally, because when Fast had got their evidence, they had lied about that. They had got a pay account on the bulletin board, so they had paid £25 a month.
Oh, right.
They downloaded some evidence, but they had downloaded it and got it all illegally. Now, the law says that illegally obtained evidence is inadmissible. So we should have been able to go away on that. And we were reasonably confident at this stage. And then during the trial, they started revealing things like messages from the message base on the bulletin board, which indicated that as I was upgrading the hardware on the bulletin board, so say I was moving from a 600 megabyte hard disk to a 1 gigabyte hard disk, I would sell off the old hard disk. And I think I made the mistake of saying, I can wipe it if you want me to wipe it. And that then became an implication that I was selling 600 megabytes of pirated data. That wasn't looking very good. We were still reasonably confident at this stage. And then for me, the point that actually made me change my plea from not guilty to guilty was when they produced the screenshot of the program UA Dialer, the blue boxing software, that showed that I was connected at the time that they raided. I was connected to and downloading or uploading software to a bulletin board in America at the time. And I realised that they were going to basically just go for anything and everything that they could make stick. They didn't want to lose. They didn't really care if I got done for theft of electricity or...
You were getting done for something.
I was getting done for something, because as long as I got done for something, they wouldn't necessarily have to... They wouldn't be subject to any costs for any damages, for a wrongful arrest or anything like that. And it became apparent that something was going to stick. And I took some advice. I had a word with my QC and said, okay, if I change my plea, what's going to happen? He said, I will go and have a chat and find out from the opposition what the result will be if you change your plea. My last track I've chosen is the intro from the PP Hammer game that I mentioned earlier that was cracked by Crystal. It's another piece of music by the same guy who did the Paradroid 90 crack-tro. It's Introfronty by Desecrator from Classic.
Beast, we're all on the edge of our seats. So, did you get PP hammered in court?
Well, before I tell you the rest of the story on the court, I'm going to tell you why I chose that particular record. The PP Hammer Crack-Tro was written by a guy called Nomad from the group Crystal, and Nomad was one of the guys who actually rang me up after I got busted to apologise, because he was of the opinion that the reason I got busted was because I'd been grassed by a member of his group. And he was really apologetic because he said, look, we've been competition, it's fair and friendly competition, but grassing someone up is not something he wanted to be associated with. So he'd rung me up. I'd never spoken to him before. I knew of him, and he's a great cracker. But it was really nice to get that sort of phone call of support. And that's another reason why PP Hammer is a track that sort of the music, the crack-tro from Desecrator means something to me. Mm. So, you want to know what happened at the court case?
Yes, we're very, very eager.
I went off to talk to or I got my barrister to go off and talk to the prosecution side to find out what was going to happen. And they said community service. So I also made a phone call to my employers and said, look, I'm at court. I'm strongly considering changing my plea to guilty, and I'm told I'm going to get some community service. What will that mean for my job? And they said, well, you're not going to lose your job. Don't worry about that. You might get a slap on the wrist. You might lose your temporary promotion. I'd been on temporary promotion for like 5 years at the time. So that potentially had a financial kick, but I wasn't going to lose my job. And that was
You
really...
didn't need all that to keep buying Amigas anymore.
Well, it was just that I wanted to make sure I could still pay the mortgage. So at that stage, when I had the all clear that it wasn't going to cost me my job, it wasn't going to give me jail time. Yes, I'd get a criminal record, but hey, whatever. So I told my barrister I wanted to change my plea, and they made me stand up in court and say, we understand you have something to say. And I said, yes, I'm changing my plea to guilty. And they said, right, thank you, sit down. We'll sentence shortly. The end result was I'm pretty sure it was 100 hours community service. This was 25 years ago, so memory isn't what it was. But community service, no fine, no costs, and we basically made an application to get all my equipment back. The Crown Prosecution Service said, no, can't do that. It's been used in the commissioning of a crime. And I said, well, if somebody gets knocked over by a car, you don't confiscate the car just because they've been knocked over by it. And they said, well, yes, but these modems have been used for distributing illegal software. That's awful. They can't be returned. And we had this sort of whole back and forth about what it was. And I think the judge got to the stage of he didn't really care. So he agreed that the modems were going to be confiscated. So effectively 5 modems at £400, that's £2,000 that was going to lose. And I got back the Amiga. The hard disks were also confiscated because they had data on them that they thought couldn't be wiped. And my specialist computer barrister, explained that they could quite easily be wiped, but they weren't going to pay for it. So I got basically back my Amigas, 2 Amigas, without the hard disks. So yes, I lost a lot of hardware. I was quite lucky. I had community service in a local old people's home, and the people there liked me and obviously considered that I was not really one of their usual lags, and they regularly seemed to sign off on more hours than I'd actually done. So I think it took about less than a week for me to do my 100 hours community service, or maybe it was 2 weeks. It was some ridiculously short period of time. I was basically going into the office ultra early for work, finishing at maybe 3 o'clock, my normal job, going over to the old people's home, doing my community service, doing 4 hours or so of community service, and they seemed to be signing me off for like 7 or 8, so it was done in no time. But yeah, between the original bust in 93 and going to court in 96, I did actually set up a new cracking group. Yeah, I couldn't resist it. I enjoyed it so much.
You just didn't learn.
Yeah, you weren't expecting this, were you?
No.
So I set up a new cracking group that we called Tension. And I found at this stage that the kind of people who were involved in that scene at the time were normally around the sort of 15 to 20 age group. And by this time, I was 30. So I was an old man by their standards, and it wasn't quite the same. I did enjoy it, and I did enjoy the thrill of arranging cracks and stuff. And my role in Tension was different. I was actually running the group, so I was doing the organising. I had to come back to the scene with a different handle, though, because if I'd just been back as Beast, they'd have been all over it. And I came back with a new handle. I was on the scene as Daffy Duck. And Fast actually twigged, it wasn't particularly well hidden, twigged that I was back on the scene. And actually when I finally got busted, there was a newspaper headline in our local paper on the front page, Daffy Duck sold pirate software.
You're lucky Disney didn't throw their hat into the ring. Or
Yeah, indeed. Warner Brothers.
Oh, is it Warner Brothers?
Daffy Duck's Warner Brothers.
I see, yeah. Showing my ignorance.
But
IP theft of characters.
Indeed. I basically found myself having to sort of give up on that as well. And it was fine. The tension thing was a bit of fun to do. And really, when the whole court case finally came to the end, I kind of gave up on that thing at that stage.
So looking back at that whole experience now, if you could have changed anything with the exception of getting caught, would you?
You're going to ask, you've just set the boundaries already, which is wrong. I wouldn't have been caught. But no, I would have been caught, but there was something we were looking into, and I wish that I had done that. We at the time had looked into a security measure, which was basically, on an Amiga, the boot block on the hard disk is called the RDB, the rigid disk block, I think it is, and it's where all the partition information hides for an Amiga hard disk. And the plan there was that you could copy your boot block onto a floppy disk, and then the machine would only be able to boot and work out how your hard disk was structured if that floppy disk was present.
Oh, so it's like having the MBR in a separate location.
And the idea would be you would have the floppy disk you would boot the machine up with the floppy disk, and then you would put the floppy disk somewhere else, under the floorboards or something. And that would have basically meant that they would have walked away with my hard disks, but when they got it to their end to look out for their evidence, they would have had nothing. And that would have been something that I wish I'd tried, but yeah, it is what it is. What will be, and it happened.
And of course, on those cracked pieces of software, there was always the cracktro with the shout-outs to various members of the group. Is there anyone that you'd like to give a shout-out to in the style of a cracktro today, Beast?
Well, I really ought to say hi at least to any of my co-sysops who are still listening. So there was Bob, who was in the same line of work as me, and who was just known as Bob. There was Hydro, who was one of the members of a group called Anthrox. I joined Anthrox briefly. We released a few titles there. I supplied a few titles to them. That was a nice time in Anthrox. There was Sprog, who was also in Anthrox and was one of my co-sysops. He was the guy who supplied some of the bulletin board hardware. There's Plunderer, who, as I said, I still know now. But no, it's really more one of those, anyone who knew me, fairly easy, I suppose, for people who really need to know to work out where they might find me. But the place to go for Amiga enthusiasts is probably the English Amiga bulletin board, or English Amiga board, should I say.
Well, Beast, it's been a fascinating insight for us into the underworld of software piracy and your own personal experiences. Thank you so much for taking the time out to share them with us today. And we've got 2 final questions for you before we cast you away on Retro Island.
Yes, the first is, which of the 8 tracks you've shared today will you take with you onto Retro Island?
Well, this is a difficult one, and I'm a bit upset that you wouldn't allow me to break the rules, because I really wanted to take another tune as a way of getting a 9th tune to be played, but you wouldn't allow me to. So I'm going to be forced to select Introgasm from Desecrator, because it has that special moment, that moment of downloading the first pirated game that I downloaded.
And you can select one software title to take with you, the only caveat being it has no online functionality. What would that be?
That game would be a more recent game. It would be the game Saboteur on the Xbox 360. And that game has the honour of being the game that I've played longest of any game I have ever played. I logged more than 55 hours on that game. And I think apart from Millennium 2.2, it's probably the only game I've played to completion, because I got the full 1000G on the achievements on Xbox Live.
Well, we'll have to see if the CRT telly on the Retro Island can be hooked up to that. We'll get IT on it. Thanks again to Beast for joining us today, and to you all for listening to Retro Island Diskettes. We'll be back soon with another guest to cast away. And if you'd like to enjoy more content from Neil and I, you can find me on the YouTube channel Back Office Show.
And you can find me on Retro Man Cave. Thank you for listening, and take care.